I just want to do a quick video talking about some of the things I've learned over the years when making desktops and tabletops that have helped me get a better result. So I just want to talk about some of the preparation for the joining faces on boards, like in this case these two boards, some of the methods I use for keeping the tabletop flat and how I actually adhere them, and then just simple little things like when you're scraping the glue off, make sure that you don't tear out any wood. So just a couple little things that I've learned, and yeah, let's get into it. I'm working on a small desk right now, and this is the top. It's going to be made out of figured maple, which has some nice ambrosia marks in there, so little marks that bugs make when they get into the tree. I've cut two pieces on my table saw to the width that I want. And what I did is I glued them up to see how well this glue line was going to go together. Now it looks pretty good. It's hard to see on the camera, but as I get toward this one edge, it's not very good. It's not good because I had a lot of trouble cutting these pieces of wood on the table saw. I had my riving knife in, I had a feather board pushing the wood up against the fence, but it was still giving me trouble. So I was having to push really hard, and for that reason the wood was wobbling around and leaving little tiny marks in there that are not going to close up very well. So what I wanted to do is I want to just take a minute to show you how I'm going to fix this. Now I could just run it across my table saw and just really just take a slight bit off this edge to try and make it a little bit better, but I'm going to use an alternate solution for this because I don't have a lot of space in my shop right now with some of the stuff that I have in here, so getting these boards across the table saw is a little tricky. So I'm going to show you something. If you have a track saw or any kind of track saw setup that can allow you to make a nice cut and nice glue line for a top like this. So what I'm going to start by doing is setting these boards up to be cut with the track saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this one over and then clamp them together and then put on my track, clamp that, and then these two boards will be put together nicely. But when you're cutting on a table saw, for instance, and if you're not really sure about the angle of your blade, if it's perfectly 90, what you do is you put one board through, and then the next board you put through, you flip it over. So if your blade is off by a certain angle, these ones will be opposite of each other and they'll match up when you glue them and flip that one board back over. Just to kind of expand a little bit on this reason why I flipped one onto the other so they're face to face with each other, like top to top, is that if you're on your table saw and you had your blade at not a perfectly 90-degree angle, if you put the boards through with the top facing up and the other one with the top facing up, you'd be left with this situation where you would have that angle on this board and this board. But if you flip one over, the situation will be you'll have that angle on this board, so 1, 2 on one, but if you flip the second board over so it's face down, then it will cut that same non-90-degree angle, and then they'll have the exact same joint. So what I did, or sorry, the exact same angle to make a good joint. So these boards, I took this top, so I've had 1 and 2, and if my track saw isn't perfectly 90, to get out of that off angle situation, you just take the top of this one, flip it onto here, so we've got, you know, this situation, 1 and 2, and then these two tops are together. So when I flip this guy back, you'll have, even if your track saw angle is wrong, they'll be mirrored to each other, so you still have a perfect joint. So I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to start off by wanting to cut these two inside edges. So I'm going to flip this over, this edge in here being cut. So I'm going to put it on my nice flat table saw. And so those edges will be nice and flat with one another. Line these up, and I'm going to clamp these two ends together. Okay, so now these are clamped together. I want to be cutting the inside edges. So I'm going to take my track saw, lay it on the boards, and set up the clamps, and then make a cut. So now I have these two pieces clamped together, and the gap is very, very nice. It's very, very tight. I have super light clamping pressure, and this gap in here is almost non-existent. Where I had gaps before, now they're perfect. Okay, I'm going to be using the Festool domino to put some dominoes in this top. The reason I like using a domino or biscuits or something is because once you get out to the middle of the table, it can be really difficult to actually align the tops. So on the edges, it's easy. You can put a piece of wood here to flatten each side and make them even. But as you get to the middle, it gets kind of difficult. So what I like to do is I like to use some dominoes, and then it'll align the whole tabletop across the two boards. If you don't have a biscuit joiner or a domino, what you can do is just use cauls. So two flat pieces of wood with tuck tape on them, and you clamp them to the center, and that'll align the tops of the wood to make sure your tabletop is nice and flat. I just want to make a couple comments about clamps right now. So if you are clamping, you want to make sure that you have force on the top and the bottom. Even if it's a thin tabletop, you want to make sure that there are clamps on the top of the piece and on the bottom. If you only have clamps on the bottom, what will happen is this will tend to bow upward, and your table's going to have a bend in it. If you have them only on the top, vice versa, it will have a bow going downward. The best thing to do is to have clamps on the top and the bottom to balance that force. But you still need to go back and check to make sure that the top is staying flat. If it's not, adjust your clamps on the top or the bottom to make sure it's flat. So once you start getting them tight, take your straight edge, check it, and if it's not flat, adjust your clamps. The other thing too is the clamps themselves really matter. Now, if you have a cheap clamp, instead of the clamp going and putting the force onto the tabletop, it'll actually bend this bar instead. So if you start cranking this together, this bar will actually start to bend on a cheap clamp. So you're not getting optimal force. And also that will do the same thing here, is this will bend and then this will subsequently bend. So even if you have a clamp on the top and the bottom, if this bar on a bar clamp is really weak and kind of flimsy, all that force will end up just bending the bar on the clamp. So clamps really matter. That's why I really like pipe clamps, because the pipe almost doesn't bend at all. All the force is going into squeezing these two boards together. I start out with two pipe clamps, and I start spreading glue on the edges of the boards, and I make sure to cover both faces very, very well. Then I end up putting the dominoes in, and these are what are going to be keeping the tabletop flat across the length of the top. Just pound them together. And then at this point, I'm just going to lay the top down between the clamps and just use the clamps to close the gap for now. So I get a little bit of squeeze out, but then I actually take the pressure off the clamps and add the rest of the clamps to the tabletop. So putting some on the bottom and some on the top, just lightly. And these are the cauls I use to keep the top nice and flat across the width of the table. They're just flat pieces of wood covered in tuck tape. Okay, and if you don't have a Festool domino, you could put one of these caul setups in the middle. You just need some deep throat clamps to kind of reach the center of the boards. As you can see, I'm putting the F clamps kind of in the middle on the ends just to kind of distribute the force. And then I'm just adding more clamps to the bottom. So I have an even number of clamps across the top and bottom, and then I just start tightening from one end to the other. Now I'm going to grab a straight edge to make sure that everything is nice and flat. If it's not, I would adjust the clamp tightness on the bottom and the top to achieve flatness. Now I'm just looking over the glue up, making sure everything is nice and tight and flat, and have a nice squeeze out, which is great. The next thing I'm going to do is, after about a half an hour, I'm going to go back and I'm going to really carefully scrape off the glue. It's just at the point where it's starting to kind of crust over a tiny bit, so it's easy to remove at this point. So I'm just doing a bit of that work. And now I'm just going to let the tabletop sit overnight. So next day, I come in, I start removing the clamps. Everything looks nice and flat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a nice sharp chisel and scrape off the glue that was on the bottom, again being super careful so I don't tear out any wood. Okay, so looking at the final result here of this maple table, just going to look at the seam. It looks really nice and tight. Maple is notoriously unforgiving for glue seams. If you have a gap in the boards that you're adhering together, you will see it. So some of the tips that I gave you, hopefully they helped for you to achieve this as well. The other thing we can do here is check for flatness. So I take my straight edge and it's nice and flat all the way across. So that comes in through the clamping. Really nice and flat. Sorry, it might be hard to see in this video, but the top is very nice and flat. Okay, so hopefully some of these tips helped. Next time you glue up a desktop or a tabletop. Thank you for watching.